Thank you, and welcome to everyone to this webinar today. It is an honor to welcome you to this webinar on women, tobacco, and human rights that we're holding during the 65th meeting of the Commission on the Status of Women, CSW, the principal global intergovernmental body exclusively dedicated to the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women. This event is co-sponsored by ASH, the International Network for Women Against Tobacco, INWAT, the French Tobacco Control Alliance, the Alliance contre le tabac, and the Feminist and Women's Movement Action Plan. Today, you will hear from 5 wonderful speakers who will share examples on how the tobacco industry interferes with women's rights, so this problem, and also provide examples on how to engage in the global platforms designed to advance women's rights to address tobacco control. Also, before we get started, I want to encourage everyone attending the webinar today to join the NGO forum at the Commission on the Status of Women, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the principal global intergovernmental body exclusively dedicated to the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women. You can register for free for more than 700 events attended by over 10,000 NGOs from all over the world, and many of the sessions will be on health, human rights, and CEDAW, the Convention Against All Discrimination Against Women. And after signing up, you can consider registering for the Feminist Women's Action Movement Action Plan, FWM-MAP events during CSW. You will be able to access the links to register by clicking on the logs, on the links and the logos on the PowerPoints that will be available after the webinar, or the follow-up email that registrants will all receive after this webinar. Some quick housekeeping issues. The webinar is simultaneous translation, French and English. Please use the icon at the bottom of the screen to choose your language. For questions, there will be ample time for questions. You can type them in the Q&A box, and you can feel free to direct them to a specific speaker, and you can write them in French or English. So we'll welcome the first speaker, Patricia Lambert, who's the director of the International Legal Consortium at the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and an INWAT board member, who will introduce INWAT. Patricia, please go ahead.
Thank you, Laurent, and greetings everyone, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us. We are really pleased to have you here for such an important parallel event to the events that are being broadcast internationally from New York. Next slide, please. So INWAT as an organization was founded in 1990. It was originally founded by women tobacco control leaders who realized that women were unequally represented when it came to talking about tobacco. And so they formed a membership organization in order to address the complex issue of tobacco and nicotine use among women and girls. The organization achieved an official observer status with the World Health Organization and also with the Conference of the Parties to the WHO FCTC. This meant that between 2000 and 2003, when the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control was negotiated in Geneva, other women's organizations participated actively in the negotiations. Next slide, please. And this is reflected in the final draft of the Tobacco Convention or the Tobacco Treaty. The treaty recalls CEDAW and also pays particular attention to the increased consumption by women and girls of tobacco products and the need for participation of women in policy making and the need for gender-specific tobacco control strategies. So that is captured in the preamble. Then in the guiding principles, there's a recognition, and this is particularly important, that only with strong political commitment to tobacco control will the tobacco epidemic be stopped. But that includes a direct reference to gender-specific risks when developing tobacco control strategies. So that political will is required not only for tobacco control, but for ensuring that women remain at the heart of tobacco control. And then in the guiding principles in Article 4.7, the participation of civil society is deemed as essential for implementation of the treaty, and that, of course, includes women's organizations. Next slide, please. The mission of INWAT is to provide contacts and expertise to organizations around the world, to specifically counter advertising and promotion directed at women and girls, and to support women-centered prevention and cessation programs, since those that are designed for men do not always suit women. In addition, INWAT publishes articles and books on the intersection of women, girls, and tobacco control issues, and presents awards to acknowledge female and women's leadership in tobacco control. And on the left, you will see an example, a screenshot of the latest INWAT publication, which came out in November 2020, and one will be issued, we hope, in May this year. Next slide, please. All of the efforts of INWAT came to the fore at the 17th World Conference on Tobacco Health in South Africa in 2018, where for the very first time, there was a gender balance of presenters for the whole conference, and there was the inclusion of a stream on equity, which women had been calling for many years. The conference ended up calling for more commitment from men to the intersection of women, gender, and tobacco control, and also more commitment from mainstream tobacco control agencies to the specific issues that affect women and girls. And then just to update you, in 2021, Margaretha Haugland, who was the INWAT president from 1997 to 2006, has kept up pressure for a gender lens on tobacco and women in the European region. And there is an indication, a clear indication there that our work is not done, because the overall finding of the report was that although tobacco use among women is decreasing overall, the rate is going down at a slower pace for women than for men. And in some countries, it's alarming to note that women are smoking more. So our INWAT's org address is on the screen, and please feel free to look us up and to get in touch. Over back to you, Laurent.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for this introductory presentation and for pointing out to this important report, which shows that also in the European region, we will not achieve the target of a 30% reduction by 2025 for women. And that is quite alarming, in my opinion, in the 21st century. Our next speaker is Kelsey Romeo-Stuppy, who's the managing attorney at ASH, and she will present why tobacco is a women's rights issue and what advocates can do. Kelsey, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I'm trying to find my screen share here. The treaty that we're talking about today, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, is quite a mouthful, so we usually refer to it as CEDAW. If tobacco is a human rights issue, it follows that it must be a women's rights issue as well. CEDAW was adopted by the UN General Assembly. It's usually described as sort of an international bill of rights for women. It's been incredibly widely ratified, 189 countries. The United States is not one of them, as usual. They signed but did not ratify, but other than the US and Palau, who have signed but not ratified, there's only 4 or 5 countries around the world that aren't party to CEDAW. So you might be saying that's great, but how is that relevant to tobacco? CEDAW has several relevant health provisions. In the preamble, for example, there's a statement that in situations of poverty, women have the least access to food, health, education, and training opportunities. So there's a health mention directly in the preamble. Article 10H includes a discussion of access to specific educational information which when we're dealing with the tobacco industry is very important that people are adequately educated. And then Article 11F includes the right to protection of health and to safety in working conditions, which is in many places where women are exposed to secondhand smoke. The actions of the tobacco industry negatively impact women in many, many ways, but I'm just going to focus on a couple today so that we sort of get an idea of what we're talking about. They specifically negatively impact the right to health of women. The tobacco industry is really adept at coming in to countries where women are gaining autonomy and empowerment and tying cigarette smoking in with sort of female independence. So you can see in some of these ads, the Virginia Slims one is equality comes with no apron strings attached. And then somehow that is an advertisement for a cigarette. There's a lot of reference to the Western world. In the bottom one, you can see they mention that it's designed in Paris. So it's meant to be very glamorous and modern. Along with this is a tie-in to women's weight that's often advertised with cigarettes and connected in that way as well. In 2018, 16% of Philip Morris International's charitable monetary contributions went to women's empowerment. And that's in countries all over the world: Argentina, Indonesia, South Africa, Israel, Jordan. So they're spending a lot of money advertising to women specifically. The next issue that I wanted to address was tobacco and poverty. This obviously negatively impacts women. Tobacco costs the global economy up to 2% of its GDP every year. But in the context of women's rights, we also need to talk about individual household finances. As an example, the poorest households in Bangladesh spent almost 10 times education. At the country level, over 10.5 million currently malnourished people could have an adequate diet if that money was spent on nutrition. Poverty also increases the likelihood of domestic violence. So this is a bad situation in many ways for women. And then we also need to talk about secondhand and passive smoke. A lot of times women are victim to secondhand smoke more than men. About 64% of the worldwide deaths due to secondhand or passive smoke are women. Even the women that are lucky not to die, they're often dealing with some serious health issues, heart attack, stroke, lung cancer, but also reproductive issues. Cervical cancer, infertility, and stillbirth can be big issues. So secondhand smoke is also a big concern. So these are terrible issues. What can we as advocates do about them? Some of the speakers are going to talk more about specific examples of both harms against women and what you can do. This is just meant as an overview, but if your country is due to report, you can submit a parallel report to CEDAW urging the committee to take action on women's rights and tobacco. You can participate in international advocacy around that, encouraging women's rights advocates and the human rights treaty bodies to consider tobacco control in their work. And part of that, when you submit a report, you can also make an oral statement. So we have some templates for reports on our ASH website, and I'd be happy to discuss that further with anyone who's interested. So that's the international, but what can we do at the local level? We can use human rights language. Often smokers aren't thinking of themselves as human rights victims, and that's what we want to encourage the discussion of. This is a human rights abuse, and that's a language we need to start including. When we're advocating to local government, we need to use that sort of language to persuade decision makers to take action. I also wanted to point out here that we want to break down the silos around this. We want women's rights advocates talking about tobacco control and tobacco control advocates talking about women's rights. So I think it's very important that we cross over into those issue areas and make those connections. That's sort of further illustrated by this intersectional diagram. We've been doing more and more of these reports at ASH, and there's so many issues that come up and intersect. COVID-19 has illustrated so many health inequities in so many countries. We are doing some work on menthol at ASH in the US that largely impacts people of color. So COVID-19 has, menthol has as well. Women of color are targeted by advertising. So we want to make sure that every time we're talking about human rights, we're making all of these connections because none of these things exist in a silo. I mentioned the templates for the CEDA reporting, and we have several other resources on our website. We try to keep this as up to date as possible for anyone interested in the intersection between tobacco and human rights. So we have numerous articles and examples, so please check out our Human Rights Hub. I also wanted to point out several other resources that I rely on or that have been published recently that are just really fantastic. The GGTC paper on women in the tobacco industry is fantastic. Unfair Tobacco, our partners in Germany, have a great piece on why women need tobacco control. And then the last one there is a link to a report that we did with our partners in Sweden as a submission to the Committee for Women's Rights. So we did that one fairly recently. That's our most recent submission to CEDA. So please feel free to take a look at that. And as always, please feel free to contact me with any questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kelsey. Our next speaker is Dr. Mira Aghi from India, and she's a behavioral scientist and communications expert, and she's a board member of the Human Rights Tobacco Control Network, as well as INWAT. And she will present the Indian experience with a focus on bidis. Mira, please go ahead. Mira, I don't know if you, I don't know if you're muted. We cannot hear you. Well, we would.
Sorry,
Mira is muted. Yeah.
Okay.
We're good. We're good.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Laurent. I want to register my salute to these women in India. Next, please. This is a typical bidi shop that you will see it all over in India, in urban as well as in rural India. Next, please. Tobacco smoking in India is mainly bidi. Bidi is actually the poor man's cigarette, and it is smoked by 81%, approximately 72 million people in India. Next, please. Now, Bidi producers, 90% Bidi producers are women. They sit in crouch position all day, and along with Bidi rolling, they take care of the house, because this is all earnings approximately $2, a little bit more than $2 a day. Next, please. Now the numbers of Bidi production. The Indian government estimates that there are 4.45 million women and children rolling bidis. Labor union and NGOs estimate closer to 10 million. Out of these, 75% women are women and 25% are children, and these are majority girls. Children have no wage structure at all. They are paid the least, although they might be doing the best work, because it requires very nimble hands to do this bidi rolling. So the girls do very good job of bidi rolling. Next, please. Now this is a picture of bidi rollers. Next one. Same bidi women and children at work. Next one. These are mostly girls rolling bidis. Next one. Now, because of the situation of women who have been rolling bidis and the disturbance created by that in the minds of other people like NGOs, health people, and all well-wishers of women and children, they have been thinking about the alternatives for livelihood for these women. However, none of these seem to appeal to women. What we decided, we thought it was best to ask the women BD rollers themselves, what would they want? So through a network for the development of participatory livelihood, I worked with Dr. Andrew Russell, Durham University, UK, on a pilot project called Pilot Research Activities last year. The project was funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund, UK, and it was administered by the Academy of Medical Sciences and Christian Medical College in India. Now, the work we organized it in 4 headings: the circumstances of the BD workers, the negatives. This is all from the BD workers. What they feel are the circumstances in which they work, the negatives of the BD worker, the positives of the BD worker, and what are the alternatives. And this was done by a qualitative research. We used focus group discussion with the 80 BD rulers in pairs. Next, please. And these are the results. Let's see what they are saying about their circumstances. One works along with my husband and earned rupees 170, which is a little bit more than $2. The second generation worker taught by parents who could not educate me. I had to drop out of school and learn BD rolling. These are all women expressing themselves. Another woman says, too much work, less income, and I'm always tired. The next one says, the job gives a regular income of rupees 120 for 1,000 rolling for 1,000 BDs. And the next one says, I want this work to end with my generation in the family. And another one says that the BD industry is declining, so there is very little full-time job. They are feeling very anxious because they think that the BD industry is declining because there has been many provisions introduced in the country about the tax on the BDs, about the conditions of the BDs, and so these women are afraid that this industry is going to come to an end. Next, please. What are in their eyes, what are the negative of this industry? The first negative, of course, is that they are worried that it is going to end and there is going to be very little full-time work. And one of them said that earlier the work was easy, now they deduct money if the quality is below expectations. And another woman says, I feel trapped in this work, I have no alternative. I won't involve my children in this work. And another woman says, I'm forced to work in the night to complete the job. And the next woman says, my girls discontinue their studies as it is difficult for me to do it again. Now, these are all the negatives from the BD workers themselves. Next one, please. And what they think are the positives of this work. They say that other work is heavy, it is cumbersome, it provides less income, and it is inflexible. Inflexible because they can't do other things while doing their job. Whereas with BDs, they can do anything at home. And one of them says, we watch TV while rolling BD and we work under the fan when it's very hot. This is only an exception because I don't think there are many women who have got TVs at home or fans at home. And then another woman says that it gives steady income and I get regularly paid. As soon as I finish my job, I get paid. And she says, no need of travel, as along with BD rolling, I can do my household work and I can also. Another woman says, when the work is done, we get immediate payment. There is no delay at all. And another woman says there is no gossip or quarrel like working outside home. And so they feel that it is a hassle-less job. And another woman says, I feel safe because I'm working at home. I don't travel, I don't do anything. Next, please. And then what are the alternatives? They tried to, one woman says, I tried to leave, but I could not get a job due to illiteracy. So I came back to this job. Another woman says, I got trapped in this job because my father said, a person who uses the stove does not need education. If you learn this job, you will get some money in hand. I learned this profession very early in life and always regretted it, why I learned it. I have given up BD work, she says. Now I make more money as a tailor and I like it. Another woman, and this is a younger woman, she says, other work like shop assistant, courier service will interfere with my education. I am studying in college and after getting a good job, I will stop BD work. Right now she's doing BD rolling, but she says after she is trained, she will give up BD job. Next, please. Now, whoever thought that the toxic profession of a BD rolling would have kept home burning during the pandemic. We all have been, many people have been saying that it is a very bad job and it's very toxic, it's very dangerous to the health of the women. Women sit in crouch positions, they inhale the smoke, they inhale the dust of the BDs, but many of them are saying that, you know, but for this work, they could have starved during this period. For about 50,000 women in Maharashtra town, whose job is to fill tendu leaves with tobacco flakes and roast tobacco smoke sticks, the BD card, they get their employees have come as a lifetime, especially as their men have been hit hard by this job, but they are able to work and get money so that the family can survive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mira, for this great presentation on the situation in India around BDs. And we'll get back to the questions with questions later on. The next speaker is the chair of the board of the Women's Environment and Development Organization, and UN representative for the International Alliance of Women. And she will give us examples on how can we create synergy between the various global governance platforms that address women's rights issues and the tobacco control movement. But I don't see if we can get our slides on.
This is it. It's
okay,
on.
Okay, good. Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Sun Young.
Great, thanks to Ash and the co-sponsors for this really timely event. My contribution really is from the feminist advocate point of view, who's participated in the Paris Climate Accord negotiations, a high-level political forum dealing with sustainable development goals, and what's happening right now at the UN Commission on the Status of Women. I really do believe that we have a very special moment here with three simultaneous crises. The one that is closest to us at the moment is, of course, the COVID pandemic, but also the climate emergency and the inequalities that we're seeing. And I do believe that our strategies on gender, women, and tobacco control needs to place ourselves into this broader context, connecting with the social movements which are part of public health, but which are in different places. So I would like to have the next slide, please. You're probably all aware of this laid bare argument that we've been seeing. The COVID pandemic has laid bare this terrible scourge of violence against women and girls and gender-based violence. We call it the second epidemic. And of course, the events in Atlanta the last few days have shown how serious this is. It has laid bare women's disproportionate burden of work due to our role in unpaid care work at home. The economic loss of employment because women are predominantly, globally at least, in the informal sector and in service jobs which have no social protection. And finally, laid bare those inequalities, which we are getting figures and statistics on this, but not enough, which show that by race, economic, cultural, political, social status, even ecological status, we are facing inequalities in our face with the deaths due to COVID related to the underlying conditions of NCDs. Next. Can you see this? The challenges that I see are really to shift our thinking fast enough and on a scale big enough to be able to deal with these simultaneous crises from tobacco and gender and tobacco point of view. And that is why I think I personally feel we should be working much more at the UN, because the UN is a place where we can accelerate action. It's not always the place where we can bring it down to the ground, but it is some place where we can speak to 193 member states at the same time. The cross-fertilization of social movements may be our best chance to innovate. That includes within the women's movement, the division between sexual reproductive health and rights, for example, and tobacco control was pointed out earlier. This is definitely something that we need to bring together and cross-fertilize. We need to find a nexus in the actions so that when we do one here, it also is helping to advance the agenda in other places. And we're not going to find that unless we start more constructive and intentional dialogues between the social movements. Using multiple accountability mechanisms, the ones in human rights are of course very strategic, but I probably will be talking about a few others that we can use. Next. First, the Commission on the Status of Women. This is the commission that oversees the implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action, which was adopted by 189 states, probably all of your governments here, in 1995. So 26 years later, we still continue through the CSW to review these 12 critical areas of concern, one of which was specifically on health, not just on sexual and reproductive health and rights, but indeed NCDs and tobacco control is mentioned in that document. What's happening now between the 15th and 26th of March is amazing. We have 25,000 participants engaging in, if you add the UN events with our events on the NGO side, 850 different events. The priority theme is set every year. This year it is on political participation related to violence against women. That doesn't mean just political leaders and heads of state. We are talking about all forms of political participation. And in the center of that is that violence against women really is the scourge which prevents the exercise of all human rights. So in this 25,000 participants that we have there, what I want to mention is what Laurent just mentioned at the beginning, which is the forum is an open forum. I'm sorry to say that we had to cap it at 25,000 and we have a long waiting list. But if you are really interested to join some of the parallel events, what has to happen is you have to contact at this point the organizers. But many of these are on YouTube and being recorded. So please try to also follow that. Events are on UN TV, and those are archived for some time. So you can go there now and see the opening, for example, and many of the side events that are run at the UN in parallel events. Next. As an offshoot of Beijing Plus 25, that is what we celebrated last year, is something called the Generation Equality Forums for Beijing Plus 25. I'm going to take a little time to explain these, because I think these are a very special opportunity. Mexico and France are co-sponsoring this Generation Equality Forum, but it is convened by UN Women and it is civil society driven. There will be an actual virtual event on the 29th to 31st in March held by Mexico. And then in the summer, June 29 to July 2nd, another virtual meeting, which will be sponsored by Paris. First, why Generation Equality Forums? This is a very important and intentional attempt to bring in youth groups into the feminist and women's movements. That includes boys and young men. So the Generation Equality Forum wants to seize the opportunity to bridge the gap between multiple generations, and so we are going to do that. We have 6 action coalitions. These are not drawn from the thin air, but are actually based upon 6 themes that cluster the 12 critical areas of concern of the Beijing Platform for Action into 6 workable groups. They are not as narrow as they look. Each of them can be expanded. So gender-based violence, economic justice, bodily autonomy, sexual and reproductive health and rights, climate justice, technology and innovation, and feminist movements. Within these action coalitions, we will have representatives lead organizations from civil society, member states have signed on, philanthropy, and to some extent private sector, and international organizations, including the UN. What is special about this is that these will not be in the UN space. These will be intentionally taken out of the UN space, civil society driven, but they will have very specific targets. They are intended to be well-financed by both member states and everyone else who contribute resource, but they will be reporting and progressing on the UN agenda. So it is a very interesting innovation to take this out of the space with these new kinds of partnerships, and then to bring it back into the space, very likely during CSW. There is room here for all of the organizations who are co-sponsors here to join these action coalitions. Of course, the one on sexual and reproductive health and rights, if you look at it as a lifespan issue, you will touch on everything that we care about. But let's also pay attention, also related to economic justice. To some extent, I believe it's also related to gender-based violence as well. Next. The High-Level Political Forum, which is monitoring the Sustainable Development Goals, is something that's probably familiar to many of you. What I would like to elaborate a little bit more on is the opportunities for NGOs. There are 9 major groups. The International Alliance of Women, my organization, has belonged to 2. You can join all of them. And these are open spaces, very different from the usual UN space. It came out of the Rio process, which tried to open the space up to non-ECOSOC accredited NGOs, and even to individuals. If you are not an NGO, but an expert, and you want to join one of these major groups, you can go online to the High-Level Political Forum, look for the major groups, and put yourself on the listserv. What do? We create a collective voice, and we produce one collective document, usually a long version and a shorter version, that is presented by a representative to member states during the High-Level Political Forum. It is a place to really act with specifically Goal 3 on health, but let's also work with Goal 5 on gender equality, Goal 11 on cities, which really is great because many of you may be working with the WHO Healthy Cities Initiative, which brings our agenda into that arena. And of course, if you look down the line of those goals, you will see a place for us in all of them. If I can return to Goal 3, I think the question I've always asked, and maybe Laurent and some of you know the answers to this, is how many governments are actually reporting on these targets on the WHO FCTC? Are we looking at the national reports? So there are these things called the VNRs, which are the voluntary national reports. This year we have 41. Some of them are doing first reports, some second, some third. Are we examining and analyzing or even working with these countries before they come to the High-Level Political Forum to see who is reporting on that specific goal, that amazing goal on the WHO FCTC? Next. I won't talk about the COP that's coming up. I think it was postponed to November. because I think probably that will come out in the discussion or with the human rights processes, because that's already been discussed to some extent. There is an opportunity in climate. We have a very large, my organization, Women's Environment Development Organizations, is helping to convene some of the women's constituency at the UNFCCC negotiations. The connection between my home environment, the safety of my environment, the safety of my community and city's environment, national and global issues, I think is something we can really elaborate on. Next. Here are my favorite related to this specific event, which has to do with data. Leave no one behind, because if we don't have data, we will leave those people behind. We can't see them. To ensure that nothing about us without us. Mira brought this up in her work, that to actually go to the Bidi workers and say, what do we need to say in order to be able to reach your constituency, is something we don't do enough. Not all women are the same. We need to go to the groups that we're trying to reach by region, by community, and ask them, what is it that's going to reach you? I'm sure I'm saying things that all of you know already, so forgive me if I'm just repeating, but I at least want to express some of these things together in one place. Then to increase the financial support, this is an interesting development that we're seeing in the Action Coalitions, a call for member states and donors to actually fund movements. And I think there's no reason why the Women and Tobacco, Gender and Tobacco movement should not be looking at this opportunity. This is not funding for NGOs. This is not standard kind of funding. This is funding to make sure that the feminist foreign policies that we're seeing coming out of Sweden and Canada actually have a movement behind them. And finally, to build these stronger partnerships, we talked about the ones between human rights and tobacco control, but also you have Habitat, which we don't work enough with, in health, which is dealing with, that is the UN Agency on Human Settlements, which covers not only urban areas, but also regional planning and planning for rural areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sun Young, for all of those great examples and opportunities for cross-fertilization and working across different fields. And to answer the questions on the number of countries that are going to be achieved the 30% reduction target, most countries are not. Impacts women's rights to health. Professor Thomas, go ahead.
Merci
Thank
beaucoup.
you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Laurent, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. I would like to give you some specific data showing the trends in France with regards to women and smoking and the health impacts of these trends. In France, since 1980, we've been seeing an overall increase in the number of smokers in France, but you can see there's a contrast here between a relatively weak decrease of men, a decrease of smokers, but a 75% increase in terms of women smokers. We've seen that between 1980 and 2002. In Europe, we have countries where there are more male smokers than there are in France. However, in France, France is the European country that has the highest prevalence of female smokers. And so we see a lot of women smokers, and this is on the rise. Now, this is a contrast with what's going on in other European countries. And here I've shown you a comparison between France and the United Kingdom. And you can see that in 1980 and then in 2012, there was a respective drop, more or less the same in terms of women and men smokers. However, in France, by contrast, there was an increase in terms of women smokers. So what is the consequence of these trends in France? First of all, tobacco attributable mortality has increased significantly among women. You can see between 1980 and 2010, we've gone from 1% to 7.1% deaths are attributable to tobacco among women, whereas with men, there was a slight improvement. If you look only at women who are under 65, it's worse because it's gone from 1.7% to 15% of deaths that are attributable to tobacco. So that's a 9-fold increase. And now if we look at 2000 and 2014, here are some statistics that also show that women who are under 65, it's almost doubled from 7.8% to 17.3% of deaths that are attributable to smoking. Now, after a large increase of prevalence since 2016, there's been a relative stabilization both among men and women. And fortunately, over the last 3 years, we've seen a rather big decrease of smokers. But you can see that there's still a rather significant prevalence of women smokers. Around 20.7% of daily smokers are women. Now, this decrease that we've seen over the past few years is relative because you can see that there's a very wide difference or contrast when you look at it by age. Prevalence of daily smoking according to age range and gender in people aged 18 to 75 in France. And we can look at these figures and see that among women and men, it is going down, but there has been an increase of women who are over 40. So we have seen the mortality and death with a lot of impacts in terms of myocardial infarction. And we see that there's about a 5% increase of hospitalization of women between 45 and 54 years old, and also an increase in the 55 to 64-year-old group. When we look at the risks of stroke between 1985 and 2011, we saw that there was that this doubled, the rate of ischemic strokes doubled amongst women. And then also we see that there are consequences in terms of aortic vascular pathology. For AAA aneurysms, there was a 25% increase, and this is for women between 2000 and 2013. Women, so a 25% increase, and then there was a 3% annual increase for women between the ages of 55 and 64 for diagnoses of AAA. Also, obviously, there's been an increased rate of lung cancer, particularly in women, but specifically in the age group 55 to 64 years old. Also relatively high in the 45 to 54 and 65 to 74 groups. And we also see that cancer mortality in women has been higher for lung cancer. And finally, we've also seen an increase of other pulmonary diseases related to tobacco, and this increase in all age ranges, but the maximum increase in the category, or the group of women 55 to 64 years old, and an average annual change in tobacco-related mortality and hospitalization for COPD exacerbation. Again, this is in France between 2002 and 2015. We conduct studies every 3 years in France, and we have been looking at the trends among French adolescents, and we've seen a 9-point decrease in terms of the number of teens who are experimenting with smoking, and a 7-point decrease in terms of daily smokers. This was a decline that was markedly higher in girls than in boys, 25% versus 20%. And but despite this, there is still a relatively large percentage of 17-year-olds who are daily smokers, around 25% in France. So some of the key points is that tobacco use in France has dramatically increased in women since the 1970s, and this trend is specific to our country in Europe. The result of this trend in recent years, a fraction of tobacco attributable deaths in women aged over 65 is 10 times higher than it was in 1980. We're also seeing consequences in terms of a dramatic increase in myocardial infarction, lung cancer, and COPD, which has exacerbated morbidity. And despite a more favorable trend of smoking prevalence in younger women and adolescents, the all ages current high level of tobacco use in women suggests that the burden of these diseases will continue to increase in coming years. And I would like to simply conclude by showing you some images. And as we've been saying, in France, we need to fight the direct, indirect, and even subliminal offenses of the tobacco industry that are targeting women specifically. And here are some of the examples. These are ads for big major brands of clothing, perfume, makeup, with international actresses, famous French actresses like Catherine Deneuve, who was a symbol of liberty and feminism in France. And so this is really showing you the opposite image of what tobacco smoking actually does represent. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Thomas.
A little bit of time for Q&A. Note that for those interested in the Generation Equality Forum, Dr. Young has put the information in the chat box. We will also include it in the email that will go to all the attendees. And as I mentioned, you will be able, if you're interested in signing for the CSW forum and the NGO action work. Unfortunately, as you heard, there's a long waiting list, but you can still try to do it, and you have that information on the follow-up emails. So we will move straight to the Q&A section, and I see that there's already a few questions. So the first one I'll ask is for Soon Young, and on the issue of gender-based violence. Ubaldo is asking, I've always been wondering if tobacco taxes and waste could be a form of gender-based violence, since those corporations come from a patriarchal perspective and have shaped or co-opted to some extent the feminist movement, at least in Spain. He says, I sort of miss the feminist movement to draw some analogy between tobacco and gender violence against women. How could we push ahead the idea that tobacco is machismo? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think we have to put you in charge of the campaign. In fact, years and years ago at the Kobe conference that we convened on women in tobacco, the WHO conference, a group of women from Latin America, from Cambodia said that tobacco advertising is a form of violence against women. It provides inappropriate and misleading information, and therefore is a violation of her human rights. But for me, I think that what you're expressing here is why we're here today, is that we are not seeing a strong convergence between even the NCD or Healthy Cities, the health movement in general, with the feminist women's movement in a way that takes it beyond sexual and reproductive health and rights. I think that is our challenge. And yeah, if you can start in Spain, that would be great.
And I'm currently in Spain. One of the things we've noticed is that even the tobacco industry is trying to frame a lot of their issues as being very supportive to women. So, for example, tobacco growers or the representations for the tobacco growers were saying stopping subsidies for tobacco will have very negative impact on women's employment. So, one of the questions that I hear here is from Velina Barova, about why the importance for the people and organizations, people working in women's rights, to not accept funding from the tobacco industry, given that they use that for corporate social responsibilities. So could any of the speakers address that issue?
Sorry, Laurent, can I say something about the abusing of women, the violence against women?
Please go ahead.
Yes, you know, I work with domestic servants, for example, who chew tobacco, and many of them reported that when they come home, when their husband comes home, he wants money for the drinks, and she has very little money. If she doesn't give him, he beats her up, and he cannot beat him up. So what she does is she goes out and chews tobacco. So there is this aspect also, that even the incidence of tobacco goes up, due to violence,
Interesting.
Thank you.
Interesting.
Sorry for the interruption.
And would you like to comment on the topic of the importance for women's rights group to not take funding from the tobacco industry, given that this seems to be a pattern, unfortunately. In France, for example, a number of women's rights groups have received money from the tobacco industry, and Kelsey also mentioned that during her presentation. Any comments on that? No one wants to address this issue. If not, I'll go straight to another question that I have. There's some reports that are suggesting that women are having a more difficult time with quit attempts, and some of it has been suggested is because of metabolic reasons. So, if you could address that issue, that to some extent it seems like nicotine addiction seems to be maybe even more of a problem for women for some reasons. And is that correct? Is that information correct?
Well, it could be a metabolic issue, which is related to the a woman's body size, and the nicotine is perhaps more active. And if they consume it, it's more active in their body, which makes them more addicted to it. So that is one aspect that could explain in part why it is harder for women to quit smoking, and to explain the psychological aspect related to tobacco. And this might explain also why women are smoking more to help combat stress. And this stress is, of course, related to the fact that they're having difficulty juggling work and home life. And then also maybe at the cerebral level, perhaps there are some who are trying to look at if there are some brain-based reasons why it is harder for women, or women may become more addicted. But it's what we are seeing is that it is more difficult for women to stop smoking, and there are many different studies that have different points of view. But I can say that overall, this is something that we do need to focus on more specifically. We need to help women so that they can receive more support and counseling in order to voluntarily give up smoking.
Maybe Patricia, before she has to leave in very quickly, and I want to address the point you made about Article 4.2D of the FCTC, which reaffirms the need for parties of the FCTC to take measures to address gender-specific risks when developing tobacco control strategies. What would be your advice on what we need to do as advocates, and what should we pressure governments to do? What should be the first steps that we should take as NGOs, as civil society?
Thank you, Laurent. I would say that the most important thing we can do is to put, as civil society, is to put pressure on governments. The fact that this paragraph on gender comes in the overall paragraph in the treaty that deals with political will is not by chance, it is by design. Because to get governments to commit the political will to do tobacco control at all and truly fulfill their FCTC obligations is hard enough. But for them then to pay specific attention to gender risks, to produce gender disaggregated information like we've just seen from France is absolutely crucial. And the only way we get that is by putting pressure and by presenting politicians and those making capacity with policy building and policy adoption is to ensure that we present up-to-date gender-specific information, like the information we've just seen from France, in the best and most coherent ways we can, and keep up the pressure. It's what civil society is so good at.
Thank you. So we really need to keep on asking for very specific data, gender-specific data. We don't want to see a situation where we make overall progress for some sections of the population where women are smoking at higher rates and prevalence is not decreasing for them. Then the topic also came up of using multiple accountability mechanisms. Kelsey, you mentioned, Sun Young mentioned it. Kelsey, you addressed it a little bit. We've done it as ASH, working with partners around the world for a number of countries. And could you give also that, because I think this is a very, very unique opportunity to really advocate for that whole of government approach as well as whole of civil society approach. What would be the key recommendations you would give to the attendees on how could they engage in that process and work around CEDA to advance tobacco control?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of opportunities around CEDA and through other international mechanisms. The number one with CEDA is that every country who's a party to CEDA is obligated to report every 5 years. It's a rotating cycle. So when your country is coming up, it's essential to try to get tobacco into the government report, as well as to submit a civil society produced parallel report. And with that is an opportunity for communications campaign, for an oral statement with CEDA, things like that. There's also a lot of one-time opportunities that come up. The Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights often issues a call for input on various topics. And anytime it pertains to a relevant topic, we try to submit a letter. So you can join our listservs and we're happy to share that. We're also happy to encourage you to take your own initiative and do that as well if you'd like.
Thank you, Kelsey. Mira, I have a question for you. In your presentation, it was very clear that the women who work in Bidi rolling, they want to get out of this field. There's also issues of they're illiterate, which gives them very few opportunities to move on. What is the government of India doing to help that transition, if anything? And if they're not, what should they be doing?
Well, you know, I think that the government, I cannot say as such that the government, what the government is doing in order to change the livelihood as these women Bidi workers. I think the government several schemes to benefit these women, but I do not think that there is a big movement from the government to find out a livelihood for these Bidi workers. And as I pointed out, I think that we will be making a mistake if we did not involve the Bidi workers themselves in the change of livelihood. You know, you saw the advantages that they see. In the last meeting that we had in India on this project, I heard the women say that now they have an opportunity to give up because their husband has got a better job. But you know, I still would like to continue to get some pocket money. So, you know, it's very difficult. It's a very difficult proposition, you know, that on the one hand, women have been at a great disadvantage because of this hard work. On the other hand, this is their own money in a way, you know. So it has been very difficult. I think the government also has hard time, you know, how to replace this. You know, what are there are organizations which came up with so many alternatives. For example, making papads. I don't know what you know, papad, I don't know how to explain them. These are those chips, big chips that Indians eat. They came up with this industry and the women said, no, we can't do that. Bidi working is much better because I can help my child, you know, if he wants food or something like that. There is no other job which allows me to do this. I mean, we all have felt that during this virtual working, we are like Bidi workers because we are doing so much other work also, yeah, along with this.
So it sounds like really this cross-fertilization issue is absolutely critical in order to, we have to obviously implement Article 17 of the FCTC, and also access to literacy, the right to education for women. There's a number of rights that are being impacted and that need to be addressed.
That of course is the responsibility of the government. And of course, today we have 70% of the women who can read and write. You know, the education among women has increased, but there are, I mean, so many problems, you know, women are facing.
Absolutely, yeah.
And,
so,
but I think I see that there is a question from Amit.
Yeah, I'm going to go on to some other questions quickly. And I know since we have more than 150 people on, I'm going to go on and extend the time a little bit.
Okay.
If it's okay with some of the speakers. They had one for France, for Professor Thomas. And regard to tobacco use of women in France, what may explain the rise in smoking since 1980? Is it only a consequence of the advertising in the media? And what would explain the difference in trends for those under and over 45? Professor Thomas?
Alors, l'augmentation du tabagisme chez les femmes.
The increase of tobacco use of women in France corresponded after the events of 1968, as you heard in France, which were very violent and which liberated women. In fact, a liberty or a freedom that is not a freedom, and they wanted to be like men. And there were also the offensives in the tobacco industry that were more advantageous, and there were more possibilities for ads at the time. So I think it's mostly this liberation trend that women thought that they were more able to smoke, and the current difference between women under 45 and over 45 years of age. This difference corresponds to those who began smoking in the 70s and 80s. Those are the women who remain smokers today at 45, 50, 60 years of age. But with the younger generations, tobacco use in France is really sort of out of fashion. It's no longer fashionable. It's no longer cool. And there was another question regarding vaping in France. There is a very significant difference with the US, and that is teenagers in France have experimented a lot with vaping, but very few have really adopted it. So in France, we don't have this fear, this significant fear that you have in the US regarding the possibility of starting to be a tobacco user through vaping. It doesn't happen according to the French studies. At least in the media, we're quite reassured. But now we need to remain vigilant. All of the regulations around vaping need to be very strict, and that way children will not have access to it. And then the young people who do vape are mostly smokers already. So there are a lot of young people who are trying to leave smoking and with vaping. Thank you for this answer.
From Amit Yadav. And I think it's a very important one, and one that maybe all of the panelists can maybe address. How do we include gender-based and human rights-based approach and action under the national tobacco control programs? What would be your recommendations? What should we do? Please, any of the panelists.
So one thing I would say is really important is the intersectional slide that I showed. We need to make sure these things work together. National tobacco control programs often don't have gender-based data, which has come up a couple times. We need to focus on that, and we need to focus on things that impact smoking for women, which we need the data to figure out exactly what that is in each country. But cessation might be different. You know, maybe texting works better for women. It depends on a lot of things. So I think the first step is data.
Can I pitch in here?
Yeah, I can.
Why don't we let everyone? Why don't we have Sun Young? You go, then Mira. Please, you go. And,
so my last word, yes. I really think that I failed to emphasize something that I feel very strongly about, which is that the tobacco control community and communications are missing 50% of the rights issue for women, which is passive smoke, secondhand smoke. And we just focus on, you know, the doctor will say, are you smoking because you're pregnant? They won't ask, are you exposed to tobacco and secondhand smoke in your workplace or at home? And that is really a mistake, because women's rights to a safe and healthy work environment for women includes that unpaid work at home. So home is part of her work environment. And so let's work from there on the issue of secondhand smoke. As Laurent pointed out, the majority of deaths actually are from secondhand smoke are among women. Thank you.
And a very good point. And by the way, there's an opportunity to comment to the UN Human Rights Council on the topic of fair housing. And that provides an opportunity for us to present in a careful way, because we understand that housing is an issue for a lot of poor people, but to present them. That's an opportunity we have until the 31st of April. And Ash is going to be coordinating a response for civil society. Dr. Mira Aghi, please.
Yes. In addition to what Kelsey has said and what Yoon has said, my biggest grudge is that the policies are made without consulting women. Women have to be consulted. Judith Mackay always have been saying 50% of the space in the globe is occupied by women. Why don't we ask women? Women have to be there when any policies are made for women, including the policy for cessation. You know, the policies are made by women, and then they blame the women that they don't work with women. Of course they won't work with women because women are not involved in those. Nobody has heard what they say about those. You know, the policies drop from the sky one day on women where they don't even know what the rationale for those policies are. So women have to be involved in those policies.
Good point. And this is what that falls on all of us, including as civil society, to ensure that women are present in every action we take, whether it's our events, our webinars, our conferences. That's why it's so important, like, for example, the World Conference on Tobacco or Health, to ensure that we have equal gender representation in our speakers and so on and so forth. So, because if not, we will not have that gender balance in policy making. Very good point, Mira. Professeur Thomas,
donc vous avez compris.
Yes, I think you understood that given the data that I presented, the number of women smokers in France is a priority concern for the Tobacco Control Alliance. And in the coming weeks, we will be putting out a specific press release on this issue. And to conclude, I would just simply say that I'm very happy that we've been able to have this discussion today, because it's international cooperation that I think is going to be the argument that's going to, or the area that's going to carry the most weight. That's where we'll be able to get more voices out, and we'll be able to continue fighting this problem so that we can decrease the number of women smokers, and we can make sure that in countries where there aren't a lot of women smokers, the tobacco industry doesn't recruit them or get them to be to start smoking.
Equality Forum, which happens to take place in France, will be a perfect opportunity to promote those type of activities, like the work being done in France, where we're also working collaboratively to present a tobacco-centric report to CIDA, which will be also with support from the international community, as Professor Thomas just mentioned. And that can be a very strong advocacy tool, and creating synergy between the FCTC Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and the Convention Against All Discrimination Against Women, and help us advance health for all, because women's health will also have an impact for the entire population. We all benefit from it, not only women, but men also.
Good point.
Unfortunately, I see that we really passed the time. I apologize for this, but I've seen that over 100 people stayed even past the time. So thank you so much for your interest on the topic. Please stay tuned for future webinars. At ASH, we conduct webinars on a regular basis. The next one is on tobacco industry interference. It's part of a series that we've been running. So please tune in for that. Again, you will have received information on how to sign up for those platforms on gender equality issues, so which provide a great opportunity for cross-fertilization. And if you have any questions, please send them to info@ash.org. And look for we'll have a new toolkit for advocates on COVID that's going to be was being updated and released for World No Tobacco Day. and or head of World No Tobacco Day. So thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing you again at the next webinar we're going to host. And a very, very big thank you to the panelists. It's been a wonderful, wonderful event. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
Merci, Laurent.
au revoir. Bon après-midi, bonne journée, bonne soirée. À la prochaine. Au revoir.
See you next time. Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you.